1 o'clock here in Chicago, so we are going to get started. Thank you for joining us for American Politics and Policy. We'll be looking at the early years into the early 20th century of our country with someone who needs no introduction in a Graham School room, Fred Beuttler, who served as our Associate Dean and now serves as one of our truly gifted instructors. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I am incredibly privileged to say I'm the Dean of the Graham School at the University of Chicago, and I'll welcome you to our gorgeous campus. It is not quite this wintry yet here, but we anticipate that is coming with potential snow showers in the next week. And let me just mention that as we're talking about winter coming, winter registration is now open at the Graham School. And so in the chat, you will see a link should you want to register. There are courses that are already full, so we encourage you to pick the course that you want now, including Fred's filling up very quickly. I also want to acknowledge we have many exciting events coming up over the next few weeks, and you can see some of those on your screen. And most of all, I want to make sure you know that on December 12th, we will have our holiday party. And in addition to mingling, which will take place from 5 to 7, and just the chance to catch up with friends, we will have beforehand one of our basic program instructors sharing her new book. From Tragedy to Apocalypse in American Literature, and the first 30 to arrive for the book talk are invited to receive the book itself with her signature. With that, I want to also say that at the celebration, we will be honoring 2 outstanding members of our team, and it is a happy coincidence that one of them is in the room with us now. Fred Beuttler will be receiving our Dean's Service Award, so if you're here, you are likely an admirer, and we hope you'll come and cheer on that award at the holiday party. The other award is going for innovation in teaching to Austin Walker, an outstanding member of our basic program instructorate. And with that, I am going to take down my screen, and we'll add Fred here next to me in a moment, because we're going to have a conversation about American politics and policy with Dr. Beuttler. Fred has an extraordinary background that many of you know. He was the deputy historian of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's been a leader in many higher education institutions, including at the Graham School, where he was the associate dean until more recently becoming an instructor. And he also has his own intellectual heritage here at the university. He got his PhD here at the University of Chicago in history. And so with that, Fred, I'm going to add a spotlight and put you here fully on the screen. And I want to start the conversation by asking you how you got the idea for this course and the timing of it, because this is part of a series, although you can absolutely enter just for the winter. And you've just finished a course that looked at the modern era and that went right through the 2024 election. So maybe we can start with kind of what you've just covered and then come into why this course in winter as we get ready for a new Congress and other matters.
Thank you, Seth. We just finished the class in the fall, and what I wanted to do is have a different chronology because it will track what this year has been. And so in the fall, we looked at from the period 1944 up to 2024. And it was great because we had to developing a very civil conversation, looking at American history while it is going on. And then we had a chance, the same people, the same students in here, to discuss after the election. Which was a very interesting and important way as a space that we could talk about what took place. And the idea with the winter course is to start with the founding, 1776 and the Constitution era, and then the first Congresses. While the 119th Congress is coming into being with the transition and the inauguration, and then the first few months of policy being set in the new Congress and the new administration. And so we're going to be looking at current events in light of history and using that history to understand some of the precedents and the experiences that we're going to be living in January, February, and March of 2025. So that's the idea. And then in the spring, what we'll do is not so much look at historical precedent, but rather look at policy issues. So, for example, immigration or healthcare or tariffs in the economy. So that's the idea of the year long. It's out of chronological sequence, but I think it fits with how our political sequence works. Election, campaign, election, transition period, and then on into the new Congress and then the new administration. So that's the idea.
And Fred, one of the points of pride at the Graham School at the University of Chicago is that we are believers in open exchange, and we really value divergent viewpoints and believe that it strengthens all of our thinking when we're in rooms where we're able to engage in joint inquiry. I know from you that you just finished a class on, these past 80 years of US history, concluding in a major election. You shared with me you had students in your class who had very different viewpoints on the election and its connection to history, and you were able to engage in really civil, meaningful dialogue across those differences. I'll just let you talk a little bit about that because I think that is so on value for what we want to do, especially in a world increasingly with echo chambers where we rarely in an intellectual setting and in a deep setting get to hear other viewpoints than maybe the ones we already have.
And it was helpful because we were a class together. We
Right.
read the same things. We use a combination of secondary sources, historians' accounts, but then also quite a bit of primary sources to understand what the historical actors were thinking and why they were pushing specific policies. And so we looked at both of those, but it was great because we were able to share our positions and also engage with the texts as a way to have a civil dialogue together in a contentious time. And one of the things in the upcoming class, this is not the most contentious election this last year. We're going to be looking closely, for example, at that difficult election and transition in 1800, where you have the first transition of power between one party and another. We're going to be looking at the formation of the first party system. And one of the things that was interesting about that, it's not only involves questions of tariffs, which I think were in the news, but also the national debt and how we should formulate that and consider, should we pay it off, should we keep it funded, et cetera. So that is, it's going to be helpful looking at this new transition into the 119th Congress and the new administration while looking at the history. So that's the idea.
Well, on his say, I think it's why history is so important. I think there's a very presentist view of the world, and there's a sense, oh, the world now only gets more polarized. The world now only has these, incredibly contentious elections. And you realize in history, they're actually episodic nature. And, we had a rise in polarization in the 60s and early 70s, and then, came back in a number of unexpected ways. And, obviously we're in another mode of some of these examples, but to realize that it's not necessarily inevitable that it flows in one or another direction and to understand how historical precedent might give us context for what we're experiencing, I think sometimes can give valuable ways of interpreting the world that, especially in a social media landscape and in a world where we're very moment by moment and sometimes hyperbolic, we can miss some of that context in a way that's really important to our ability to engage with the present. So thank you for helping us to bring that historical lens. And I want to now jump in, Fred, to the class that you are teaching this winter, because you're going to cover a lot and you're going to do so across a time period, but also with some very specific themes. And so I want to draw out some of the themes that will be embedded into this course. And the first one I want to draw on is these kind of constitutional procedures, because it's happening obviously 1776 onward, is that we're both writing and then we are beginning to engage in these constitutional procedures. I'm thinking electoral process, the role of the Senate. Can you talk about how your class is going to look at issues of process and constitutional procedure?
Yes, we're going to do two things. One is look at the Constitution itself and some in the Constitutional Convention and trying to understand what the framers are thinking about when they set up things like, for example, it's in the news that the Senate has the power of confirmation of the president's cabinet. We will look at that, but also the question of recess appointments, because that is in place too in the Congress's schedule, and how that functions, and to try to understand what the founders were thinking and the logic behind some of their decisions as they set up the structures that are in our constitutional government. The second thing we'll do, though, is because often what the framers will do is sort of set up um, sort of guidelines and have the historical process develop it. So, for example, the role of the speaker. The role of the speaker is a constitutional office. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is a constitutional office, but rather than being like the mere referee that it is in the English House of Commons, it now is leader of the party. And that's a historical development that has taken place. And we have to look at history to see how the historical actors framed and fleshed out the skeleton that was the Constitution. So we're going to do both looking closely at the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and the ideas of the framers, but also how it developed as the various struggles between the branches of House, Senate, President, and Supreme Court. So that's the idea.
So another big theme, which again is going to echo a lot of current conversation, is the relations between the state and federal government and how that evolves over time and the big debates. And obviously, we are having this conversation just after the nomination of McMahon as the, potential Secretary of Education, and a vision to potentially end that department, and a big change there would take place, if so, on state-federal relations. Can you talk a little bit about how you'll look at that from a historical context at this relationship between different views of federalism?
Yeah, that's a very contemporary topic, but one that the framers had in mind when they set up the separation of powers, not only from within the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, but also between state and federal government. And it's been interesting and helpful in some ways to look at over the last 4 to 5 years, 6 years, really from COVID, that we see the operations of the federal government versus the state government. It's somewhat striking to realize that the most powerful person in the world, the US president, cannot close your local elementary school. And that's something that is federalism right there, state power versus federal power, and whether the states can nullify, for example, a federal act within their own states. And that was an issue that was raised because the Constitution is ambiguous on that. And it only gets fleshed out within history. And we'll look at several of those times where state resistance to federal encroachment will take place, or vice versa, where the federal government needs to force the states to come in line with our constitutional framework. And so we'll be looking at not only times like during the Adams administration, where John Adams will put restrictive acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison will suggest that the states, especially Kentucky and Virginia, will have the power to nullify those, or basically declare those acts unconstitutional within their states. We'll also look at the time during Andrew Jackson, the nullification crisis there. And then, of course, in the Civil War and Reconstruction, as you pass the very significant 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, really clarifying federal power over the states, especially in the area of race. So those are a lot of the topics, but the structural issues are still contemporary and still present. We are a nation of states, and we'll watch and see where, if you actually look at how the Declaration of Independence is set up, united is an adjective, states is the noun. After the Civil War, United States is a compound noun. And it's interesting to think about where your primary loyalty is. It to your state, which pre-exists the Constitution, in the case, for example, of Virginia, or is it to the United States as a whole? So I think that's a very contemporary topics, but we want to look and see how those same issues are contested and resolved in the historical context.
So another theme that, again, is going to feel very present, and one that is still debated in structure, is the party structure and system. And during this time period, you have the first, second, and third party systems, the third being one that holds for quite some time to the present day. Can you talk a bit about parties, how they were viewed, and how that debate has continued around the structure of parties today?
The framers are trying to find ways to avoid party. They see party, they call it faction, as something that is inherently destabilizing to a Republican form of government. But very quickly, parties emerged, centered around two key figures within George Washington's administration, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And many of their policy differentiations that develop into parties are still with us over questions, for example, of how to fund the federal government. Should be over tariffs, for example. Should we have a large national debt or should we pay it off? Should we be primarily an agrarian country or primarily an urban commercial industrial country? These are some of the policy differences that led to the formation of the first party system. And that's one of the things that George Washington warned against in his farewell address. He saw the danger of faction and especially the reversal to another, from one party to another in each election cycle. So he already sees that in 1796. But we're looking at that because now what we're seeing in the most recent election, perhaps, is maybe a transformation or a realignment in the parties. And so we've had a period over the last 30 years where we haven't had a majority party. There's been divided government and alternating between party control on the House or the Senate or the presidency, and it goes back and forth. And we've seen that only a few times in the last 30 years have there been one party control of all three branches. We'll have that in this coming 119th Congress, but I bet by the 120th, it'll go back to divided government again. But we're in the process of a transformation potentially. It's too soon to tell, but a party realignment and different interest groups move in one direction or another. It seems like that. It's not our parents' party system anymore. And in looking forward, it may be. So we're going to look at how parties form and how parties break down and realign, because that took place at least 3 times, sometimes 4, depending on which historian you talk to, but in the period that we're going to be looking at from 1776 up to in the 1920s. So party structure and party realignment and how different interest groups shift to different parties and different policy positions shift to different parties. That's going to be one of the themes of our course coming up in the winter.
Well, so we have a lot of questions coming in, and I want to encourage continued questions because we'll get to them shortly. I want to lay out one more question now, Fred, on the course, because when I was reading the syllabus and description, you look at the rise of populism in response to greater centralization of power. And you also look at the development of progressivism and the creation of the administrative state. And obviously, those are two themes that continue to echo today in our politics. And so I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about rise of populism, rise of progressivism, how you see those in this period of time that, is going to predate us by at least 100 years or more, but continues to have real relevance to our politics today.
Well, some of this goes all the way back to the debates over the ratification of the Constitution. The New York governor, George Clinton, no relation, was an anti-federalist, and he fought the Constitution. And one of the things that disturbed him was that there would be a federal district.
Hello.
We need to mute that. Sorry about that. Keep going, Fred.
All right. He was worried that the Constitution set up a federal district, which he considered was going to become, quote, the asylum of the base, idle, and avaricious. He's envisioning what the elites in Washington versus the people already back in 1789. But that's a continuing theme. Andrew Jackson is one that chooses the people against New York and Washington elites, especially in the late 19th century. There is moves for the People's Party. There's a political party that forms. It gets incorporated into the the Democratic Party in the 1896 election. But it's an idea of a recurring theme of the people versus Washington. And we want to see how that continues throughout, really from the time of the ratification of the Constitution through Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Jackson, and onto the People's Party and populism under William Jennings Bryan and into the progressive era. So these are things that are, well, not sure Mark Twain said it, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes sometimes. And that's something we want to see, these various rhyming periods or rhyming issues that take place. And populism and progressivism are both parts of those. I think that's an important thing that we want to have the historical precedent as we try to understand our own times.
Well, not surprisingly, given the extraordinary lifelong learners that are part of our school, we have incredibly thoughtful questions in the chat, and I want to come to some of them. Paxton Murphy writes, can you speak to support for or opposition to electoral college changes, depending on which party stands to benefit? And of course, I'm reminded of the election in the 1820s, where, you know, it is ambiguous because of electoral college between Quincy Adams and Jackson, and comes in the House, but maybe there's at least that. There may be other times too during this period where the Electoral College is a big point of debate and discussion.
Yeah, that's a good question, especially as we look at debates recently over the differences between the Electoral College victory and the popular vote. And the founders are thinking about that in the formation of the Constitution itself. And they realized they made a mistake in the election of 1800 because there the electors voted for president, and the first person, the one who had the largest number of electoral votes became president. The one who had the second number became vice president. But the problem is they didn't anticipate parties. And so the election of 1800 gets thrown into the House of Representatives to resolve. And it goes for months as to resolution of how that who would finally be president. The election of 1824 has electoral college issues that gets thrown into the House of Representatives. The election of 1876 is disputed with electoral votes. And so they actually have to form a commission in order to find some way to resolve who will become president. And that leads to a lot of horse trading, and it ends Reconstruction. That's one of the bargains that's put in place. But what the framers had in mind with the Electoral College and how has it's changed, I think is a very contemporary issue and a very important one, that we understand the precedent, the ideas behind it, but also the vision of the United States as a union of states, a federal union of states, rather than a simple national government. And so that all comes into thinking about the functioning of the Electoral College. So I think that it's a very contemporary topic. It's one that in 2016, we saw 7 electors vote differently than the popular vote in their state. And so that's also something that's an issue. And we've also seen that the framers wisely said that each elector has to vote in their own state. They can't vote in one central place. The interesting precedent that's there and far-sighted thinking, but also some mistakes that were made that were corrected later on. Yeah, the Electoral College is going to be one of the key themes that we're going to be looking at, and the process of voting, because that as well is going to be an issue. Should there be secret ballots? Should there be ballots based on party, etc.? These are all fought over in American history. So yeah, the process counts, is very important. Yeah.
Tamara Boston has a question following up on the federalism conversation. How has the nullification doctrine influenced debates over federal education policies, such as school desegregation or Common Core standards?
That's a very good question, because traditionally and really up until 1865, or I'm sorry, up until 1965, the historian sort of misses centuries occasionally. Up until 1965, there's not a very large federal role in elementary and secondary education. There is some after the 1954 Brown v. Board of Ed decision, but that is delayed. There's significant resistance in the South. And Dwight Eisenhower actually has to send federal troops down to Little Rock in order to enforce the integration of Little Rock High School. That was the first time since Reconstruction that federal troops were in the South. And so there is a sense that we decide things as a whole people. But there's also provisions that through federalism, we let the states experiment on their own and have power on their own on most areas. But sometimes the federal government, or actually the overwhelming majority of the American people, want to have certain policies all together, and that will be enforced. And for example, that was the case after Brown v. Board of Ed and the federal enforcement of integration in Little Rock High School. And so those are going to be things that we'll look at in the 18th and 19th century context, but you'll also see a federal role for education right after the Civil War in Reconstruction and the setting up of the Freedmen's Bureaus, where you have federal involvement in education in the South, and also Northern philanthropic education, involvement in education for the freed slaves and African Americans. So those are going to be some very important topics that we want to see the precedent behind it, see the experiences that we have gone through together as a people as we try to struggle again with a non-legal segregation of schools, but a de facto segregation. Places like in Chicago public schools, for example. Yeah, and what the federal government and what state governments can do about that.
Greg Gosick writes, the historical transition, which 2024 seems most analogous to, is 1828's advent of the Age of Jackson, which of course comes the election after the 1824 decision by the House. You noted that the era's state resistance via the nullification crisis. There also were a variety of political and policy parallels from a new party system to border issues involving Texas that were operative. Will your class look at such additional dimensions of that period?
Absolutely, yes. It's not an accident that Donald Trump, in his first term, put a bust of Andrew Jackson very prominently in the White House. And it was interesting, his predecessor removed that and put it off someplace else. And so there is a struggle over the main story of American history and how those different parts of it come together. And one of the things that you'll see, Andrew Jackson was a very unique figure in American history, or in was a world history. And the Europeans always, they couldn't quite understand Jacksonian foreign policy, but he will set up, Andrew Jackson, a very distinct foreign policy, quite a bit different than Hamilton's and Jefferson's, and quite a bit different than Woodrow Wilson's. But Donald Trump is seeing similar things of an America First style that you saw with Andrew Jackson. And so Andrew Jackson's suspicion of New York bankers is one that we'll see how that works, working its way out 2 centuries later. But their presidents model themselves, or at least see themselves following precedent and certain kinds of precedent. And so, yes, very clearly, we're going to have to look at the personality of what some had called King Andrew, or King Andrew the First. He was labeled by some of his congressional opponents. We'll see to watch in this that I think it's going to be useful to see and to find some ways that history may rhyme and may then, since we're in such a different context, be quite a bit different, and to see how policies that worked in the 1820s and 1830s may not work the same when the United States is a global power and involved in almost every country worldwide. So that's going to be a different issue. And so not to see that if there's precedent, it will happen again the same way. It doesn't repeat itself, but there's themes that come back, and that's one of them. Yeah.
Jerry says, do you think the preamble of the Declaration of Independence and not the Constitution make any claims on contractual rights of the people? How do you see those pieces of preamble in the Declaration as playing out over time in having meaningful rights-giving roles in society, in American society?
That's a really good question. One of the central questions in the founding era. What is the relationship between the Declaration, especially that second paragraph? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, we're familiar with that. What's the relationship between that and the Constitution? Does the Constitution put in place those God-given rights and thus need to be worked their way out throughout the rest of the document, meaning that is the purpose of the Constitution the process by which those phrases in the Declaration become part of the American way of life, or is it the right of revolution when one's property is at stake? That is also a reading of the Declaration of Independence. And thus the Constitution then becomes just a means to protect property and not the all men are created equal. And so that is an ambiguous relationship. The framers don't establish it. They do talk about in the preamble of the Constitution a more perfect union, how something could be more perfect if it's perfect. But Abraham Lincoln is going to be one to redefine the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution. And so if we look and examine maybe a recent controversy we had a class on a couple of years ago, when is the real founding? Is the founding in the United States in 1619? Is the founding of the United States in 1787 with the Constitution, or is the founding in 1776 with the Declaration? And that's what Abe Lincoln said at Gettysburg a couple days ago. The anniversary was a couple days ago. That he said 7 years ago. That's the origin. And if you do the math, 4 is 80 plus 7, 87 years ago from 1863. That's 1776. He's making a very clear claim that the purpose of the Constitution is to enact those first couple sentences of the Declaration. But that is a contested thing through much of American history until the Civil War. And it even comes back with Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was the one to diminish the Declaration in favor of the Constitution as a mere process. He says the Declaration is just it's not an act of political theory, but an action, a document justifying revolution, not setting up a political theory like all men are created equal. And so that'll be contested through much of our period that we'll be looking at. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question.
One other thing you mentioned, Fred, is you're going to look at how issues resonate and change in policy views over time. And I know a few issues from our prep conversation that are in your vision for this course. We talked about tariffs and foreign trade. We talked about immigration. I mean, since those are such big issues in the current conversation, can we maybe touch on each of those and talk about how our debates and thinking about those as a country evolve over time? And maybe let's start with tariffs and foreign trade, because we've seen a lot of movement there over history. Obviously, in our modern time, we've gone from a place of having tariffs to a place of free trade in the 80s until, somewhat recently, and then in the last decade pulled back. But talk about it during this period, because these debates start, with the founding of the country and the ability to even think about taxing and tariffs, and they continue all the way through.
It's a very good, one of the good starting themes because it's now resonating. It was an issue in the campaign. It was interesting. Both parties actually talked some about tariff and protection. So I think it was interesting. But that's the first thing the first federal Congress does is set tariff schedules and custom duties. They have to find ways to fund the United States government and to pay off much of its debt that it had. So the first thing Congress does is start debating custom duties and tariffs. And that is an issue that is throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. It's sort of amazing to think about, but in the late 1880s and 1890s, the federal government had very high tariff walls. But because of that, it actually ran a surplus. The federal government had more money than it knew what to do with in some ways because of the tariff walls. But then it had a period of reductions in tariffs, and you'll see that's one of the recurring themes, the need for funding, but also to protect domestic industry, to keep jobs in the United States. And that's one of the things that Hamilton is arguing. He wants to protect domestic manufacture, whereas Thomas Jefferson is wanting to lower prices for consumers. And so these themes are with us from the beginning, and they go back and forth. Sometimes a party will want to have high tariffs. others not. And so you saw in the party of Thomas Jefferson, which becomes the Democratic Party, they're pushing for low tariffs. But in the New Deal, or at other times, they actually were calling for higher tariffs to protect domestic industry. So it goes back and forth to see it as one party is the party of free trade, then the other party will become the party of free trade. So that's one of the issues that we'll discuss. Immigration is a major issue, and one of the first things that is done. Congress does a number of things in the first Congress, but the first Congress passes the first Immigration and Naturalization Act. And that is going to be one that is with us as to how and what kind of people we want to become citizens. The Constitution doesn't define citizenship. It's ambiguous. But the 14th Amendment, after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment does define citizenship. And I've noticed in the news the last couple of days, that's again at issue. The question of birthright citizenship. That's a thing that we're going to have to look at and examine. What is the legal and constitutional status of who is a citizen? Yeah, and that's going to be one that's very important. I'm going to modify a little bit of the class. It said we're going to go from 1776 to 1920, probably go into the 20s, because that's where you'll have immigration restriction that gets reversed in 1965. We talked about that a little bit in last fall's class, but I want us to see what some of the arguments are, because I think that's going to be an issue. It's already been signaled that that's an issue in 2025 and 26, incoming administration.
So, Fred, I want to just take a step back because you've just gone through so much history that sets us up for the current moment. In a time where we have a president who is committed to really changing government and the way things work, and that's, a stated goal, whether you were seeing him skeptically or whether you're a huge enthusiast. I think that is a rare point of agreement that everyone would see. This is someone who wants to fundamentally change, right, the way the government has operated for a long time. How do you think about the value of history to a moment like this? Because in many ways, I think one of the commitments is not to let history or precedent define what we may do. How do you think about the role of history as we engage in this moment as citizens and as we think about where we are?
I think it's absolutely central. We need to have a good understanding historically. And one of the things that came out of the class last fall, the one that just finished up this past week, is some of the students, the participants in the class, were like, we wish everybody else could have a class like this. Because as we walk through the times that Americans have been in conflict with each other, it pays to see how our predecessors worked out some of these issues in a civil and constitutional framework. And I think it was very helpful to increase the civility among people who disagree over policy issues, and honestly disagree over policy issues, because they have a slightly different view of what they see the future is going to be. But they were able to talk through things, to able to come to an understanding of the other person's perspective. As somebody said, one needs to interpret what they say before we evaluate. And that process of deliberation that's built into the Constitution itself, where you'd have the passions of the moment. Well, the founders thought that that would be reflected in the House of Representatives. And you do have a very passionate chamber that's there, and it sometimes come to blows with even fisticuffs on the House floor. In his time, as you see the policy provisions reflected in the representatives that are chosen. There's a very interesting book we'll look a little bit at as it leads up to the Civil War, because it's not a lot of reporting, but you get clues as to the disruptions in the House chamber as Southerners versus Northerners try to express their provisions in a very tense situation of sectional divide. That's the House. But the founders set up the Senate, and Jefferson wasn't there at the formation of the Constitution, but he asked Washington later, why did you put the Senate as it is with a 6-year term, emphasizing deliberation? And Washington responded to Jefferson, why do you pour your tea into your saucer? And Jefferson said, well, to cool it. And Washington said, precisely. And so the passions of the majoritarian body of the House of Representatives is met by the calm deliberation of the Senate. And that's by design by the founders. And so we're going to watch that play back and forth as each branch struggles for authority. We'll see it. We saw it now recently because President Trump wants to set up and have his cabinet choices chosen
Right.
by recess appointments. And the Senate is one that is like, no, that's a constitutional power given by the Constitution for the Senate to advise and confirm cabinet choices and federal officers. And they're going to do it. They will jealously guard their power, that's my anticipation. And I would imagine the Senate is going to do that. And soon the House will also guard its power as we watch and see how the struggle between these branches will take place, regardless of whether there's one party in or not. I thought it was interesting leading up actually last week where the incoming president wants his candidate for Senate Majority Leader. And the Senate majority decided definitely not. They have their own candidate. And we've got a new Senate Majority Leader who will be his own person. Yes, the same party, but of a very different body than a sort of top-down authoritarian structure. This is a federal structure with division, separation of powers. And that was what the framers wanted. Ambition made to counteract ambition. And that's where the people's liberties are, in that space between those powers.
It's a brilliant articulation, Fred. And of course, it's structurally embedded because here you have a body that has 6 years in between elections, right? And so 2/3 are going to be either 4 years or 6 years, by which point Donald Trump is either a lame duck or far out, given, he'll be in his second term. And so here is actually a body that has that ability, right? And so recently on the Gates example, you have House Speaker who has a 2-year term. He's coming out and saying, we're not sharing anything. And these individuals that have 6-year elected, states, they say, we want everything, right? And so, you could not have more plainly structured, here is the way that you get to this. And of course, then it may, in some of these cases, not this one, but go to a court that has lifetime appointments. And so, all of these things are in a milieu where even with the same party having all three branches, just that structural issue of having different election cycles, right? That alone creates a check and balance. Again, very different in nature than if you had different parties or more independent. So we'll see less checks, obviously, in the next 2 years than we would potentially in a divided government, but still checks just based on one feature of many that are put into this system. So it's a remarkable example indeed.
Absolutely. And the founders and the framers of the Constitution are envisioning this. They understand that legislative bodies are jealous of power and want to gain more power, but the only way to check that is other power-seeking bodies, so that you have, as Madison says, ambition to counteract ambition. And it's interesting because one of the things that we'll touch on towards the end of the course is how the growth or Congress giving up its authority to administrative agencies. And Woodrow Wilson, the only president with a PhD, by the way, and a student of Congress, wants to pull power away from Congress. And there are times then that Congress is more than happy to give away some of its power. And we'll see that. And we'll see now, I think Congress will try to take some of its power back. I think that's an important thing. But this is a balance that we watch in the struggle over the policy initiatives in the House, Senate, presidency, and the federal courts.
Well, Fred, thank you for taking the time to visit with us. Thank all of you for joining us. Your work in history is incredibly important to our understanding and to our engagement as citizens in the present day. We're grateful for your teaching this open enrollment. I want to acknowledge that every summer you teach teachers, so teachers in the high school system across the state who really want to deeply engage in the big contestations in history and come to the university and take your course. And we're so grateful to be the host of that. And then I do want to also say, for those of you who are interested in these topics, in addition to potentially taking Fred's class, in April, in person here at the university, Graham is thrilled to be launching our Bowie Stewart lecture series, where our first speaker will be Pulitzer Prize winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. Fred, let me give you the last word.
Oh, two last words. The first one is the class will be offered on Monday afternoon and Monday evening. So Monday afternoon starting January 6th and then Monday evening. So those are the two times for the sections. But thank you so much for this Graham School. This has been our mission from the beginning to bring some of the best ideas and necessary ideas about democracy to everyone. It's a broad, wide audience. That's the vision from the beginning, from the start. I'm so honored to be part of this because through the Graham School, we get to teach teachers and teach citizens how better to make the United States to be the self-governing democratic republic that the founders have given us. So thank you very much. I'm honored to be a part of this.
Well, we're honored to have you and grateful for everyone being with us to celebrate our journey into American history as a school. Have good afternoons all.